They say power corrupts, but what they don't tell you is how far people will go to protect it. In today's story, we're going back to the 1920s, an era of oil money and secrets behind closed doors. This is a tale of backroom deals, political betrayal, and a mysterious double death that was never truly solved. It's a real crime case buried beneath marble mansions and government handshakes, forgotten by many, but still echoing through history. Welcome to True Crime Echoes, and this is the Teapot Dome Scandal, Chapter 1, A House Too Secure for Murder. Have you ever stood in front of something so beautiful, so grand that it almost didn't feel real? Like, no way this could belong to a regular human being. That was my first reaction when I saw photos of Greystone Mansion. The marble staircases, the velvet walls, the chandeliers that looked like they were stolen straight out of Versailles. 55 rooms, its own movie theater, bowling alley, and get this, even a secret vault just for fur coats and diamonds. Yeah, that kind of place. It was built for the Dohenis, one of the richest families in America at the time. Oil money, big oil money, the kind of money that builds dynasties and crushes people quietly. And in February of 1929, 2 men were found dead inside that mansion. Not just any 2 men. One was Ned Doheny, son of oil tycoon Edward Doheny. The other, his best friend, personal assistant, and maybe something more, Hugh Plunkett. Now here's what gets me. This house had tighter security than most government buildings. Private guards, steel gates, guards with guns. Greystone wasn't just secure, it was impenetrable. So how did 2 people end up dead inside one of the most locked-down mansions in the country? The official story was simple, too simple. A murder-suicide. Hugh Plunkett had a mental breakdown and shot his friend Ned, then turned the gun on himself. Case closed. Move on. Nothing to see here. Except everything about the scene raised more questions than answers. There were no fingerprints on the gun. Powder burns on Ned's wound suggested a close-range shot, like face-to-face. And somehow Hugh managed to shoot a man, then himself, all while still holding a lit cigarette between his fingers. Come on. It didn't add up, not to me. Not to the lead detective on the case, either. But here's where it gets darker. Ned and Hugh weren't just close. They were inseparable. They lived together, traveled together, worked side by side. They were scheduled to testify under oath in a massive federal bribery trial just weeks after their deaths. A trial that involved oil barons, government officials, and enough corruption to make your head spin. And then, poof, they were dead. What's even more unsettling? The case was shut down within 48 hours. No grand jury, no public inquest, just a quiet burial and a loud silence that followed. I've read enough of these stories to know that silence usually means someone somewhere had a lot to lose. And in this case, the list of suspects includes some of the most powerful men in the country at the time. One of them, Ned's own father. Another, a man who would become the first U.S. cabinet member ever to go to prison for corruption. So what really happened that night at Greystone? Was it a tragic mental breakdown like the headlines claimed? Or was it a calculated cover-up designed to protect an empire built on oil power and secrets? To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the start of the 1920s, to a time when oil wasn't just a commodity. It was the new gold. And America. We were sitting on oceans of it. This is the story of how a secret oil reserve, a dead president, and a bag full of unmarked cash unraveled into one of the darkest scandals in U.S. political history. And at the center of it all, 2 men found dead in a house that was supposed to be untouchable. Let's start from the beginning. Chapter 2, The New Gold. When we think of wealth today, we think of tech empires, crypto millionaires, maybe real estate tycoons. But back in the early 1900s, there was only one king oil. Oil was everything. It powered ships, trains, cars, factories, hell, even the military. The world was changing fast, and oil wasn't just fuel. It was power. If you controlled the oil, you controlled the future. By 1921, America was pumping out over 80% of the world's oil supply. That number still blows my mind. 80%. Imagine the kind of influence that gave the US on the world stage. And at the center of it all were these massive oil companies, some names you might still recognize today: Sinclair, Standard Oil, Pan American Petroleum. They weren't just companies, they were empires. And in the middle of this oily gold rush, the US Navy had a problem. You see, they just made the switch from coal to oil-powered ships. That meant they now depended entirely on this volatile, unpredictable commodity. What if we ran out? What if war broke out again? They needed a backup plan, so Congress passed a law in 1912 called the Naval Petroleum Reserves Act. It sounds boring, I know, but it was a big deal. Basically, the government decided to set aside massive oil fields across the country, untouched, locked away for military use only. Emergency reserves, just in case. No drilling, no leasing. Off limits. One of those reserves was in Wyoming, a strange, rocky patch of land called Teapot Dome, named after a weird-looking rock formation that resembled, well, a teapot. I'm not kidding. That's literally how it got the name. People back then didn't overthink things. But here's the important part. These reserves were sacred. No one was supposed to touch them unless the country was in real danger. They were a national safety net. And as long as they stayed off limits, it meant the government still had some leverage in a world that was increasingly being bought and sold by oil tycoons. At least that was the idea. But ideas don't mean much when money gets involved. And the oil industry, it was filthy rich. I'm talking private trains, sprawling mansions, gold bathtubs, the whole Gilded Age fantasy, but soaked in crude. And where there's that much money, there's always someone looking to take a slice. The people in charge of guarding these reserves, they weren't just politicians. Many of them were old friends, poker buddies, men who thought government was just another good old boys club. And into this world stepped a man named Warren G. Harding. Harding wasn't a statesman. He wasn't a visionary. He was charming, good-looking, and very good at saying what people wanted to hear. When he ran for president in 1920, his campaign slogan was "Return to Normalcy." That was it. After the chaos of World War I and the Spanish flu, people just wanted peace, quiet, and maybe a bit of comfort. And Harding promised all of that. He campaigned from his front porch, literally. While other candidates were traveling cross-country giving speeches, Harding stayed home in Ohio and let the press come to him. And somehow it worked. He won, by a landslide. But here's what most people didn't know. Harding's campaign wasn't just fueled by popularity, it was being bankrolled by oil. Two of the most powerful oil men in the country, Harry Sinclair of Sinclair Oil and Edward Doheny of Pan American Petroleum, had a plan. If Harding got elected, they'd finally get access to those secret government reserves. Oil fields worth millions, maybe billions. And if that sounds like a conspiracy theory, it's not. That's exactly what happened. But Harding couldn't do it alone. He needed someone he could trust to manage those reserves once he was in office. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Someone loyal. That's when he looked to one of his oldest friends, a man with a Wild West mustache and a reputation for being both ruthless and discreet, Albert Bacon Fall. And that's when things really started to boil. Chapter 3. The Boys Club and the Fall Guy. Sometimes when people talk about history, it sounds so distant, like it's something that happened to other people in another world. But the more I learn, the more I realize history repeats itself because human nature rarely changes, especially when it comes to power and greed. After Warren G. Harding won the presidency in 1920, he got to work, just not in the way you'd hope from the leader of the free world. See, Harding wasn't interested in reform or vision. He wasn't even particularly qualified for the job. But what he did have was a loyal group of friends, drinking buddies, poker pals, the kind of men who got together in smoke-filled rooms and talked business over bourbon. They called themselves the Ohio Gang. Not exactly subtle, right? Most of them weren't even from Ohio, but it didn't matter. The nickname stuck because this group operated like a small-town mafia inside the White House, and Harding. He welcomed it. His philosophy was simple: reward loyalty. If you had his back, you got a seat at the table. Competence was optional. One of those seats went to Albert Bacon Fall, an old friend, a former senator, a rancher from New Mexico, who looked like he'd walked straight out of a cowboy movie. He had the big mustache, the weathered face, the boots. He looked like a man who knew land cattle and law. But more importantly, he was someone Harding trusted. Harding made Fall Secretary of the Interior, which meant he was now in charge of all federal lands and natural resources, including, yes, the naval petroleum reserves. That oil stash we talked about earlier, the one that was supposed to be untouchable unless the country was under threat, that was now under Fall's control. At first glance, maybe it didn't seem like a big deal. Fall had experience with land after all. But behind closed doors, something much more calculated was happening. See, this wasn't just a friendly appointment. This was part of a long, deliberate plan. Fall wasn't there to protect public resources. He was there to give them away to the people who helped put Harding in office. It was a favor for a favor. But here's where things start to get weird. Because originally the plan had been for another man, Jake Hammond, an oil insider from Oklahoma, to take that job. He was the one Sinclair and Doheny had lined up as their inside man, but just months before the appointment, Hammond was shot dead by his mistress. No trial, no further questions, just dead and gone. And suddenly, Harding needed a new man for the job, someone loyal, someone who wouldn't talk, someone he could count on to keep the whole operation quiet. So he called in his friend Albert and Fall. He didn't hesitate. He didn't just take the job, he immediately pushed for an executive order that would give his department full control of those oil reserves. President Harding signed it. No debate, no public discussion. Just like that, Fall had the keys to America's emergency oil stash, and no one was watching. Now, I want to stop here and ask, why is that always how it works? Why do the people meant to safeguard public resources end up being the ones who exploit them? And why is it always the quiet deals, the backroom appointments, the invisible strings pulled by men in power that shape the direction of a nation? Fall wasn't a fool. He saw opportunity. He saw debt. His own ranch in New Mexico was bleeding money he owed back taxes, and his reputation, while solid on paper, was starting to crack. So when oil barons came knocking with briefcases full of untraceable cash, he didn't even blink. This wasn't about patriotism. It was about survival and greed and fall. He was just getting started. Chapter 4. The Cost of Loyalty. There's something terrifying about how easily a deal can be made in secret. One handshake behind a closed door, one signature on a quiet piece of paper, and just like that, millions of dollars and entire public resources are rerouted into private hands. No alarms, no headlines, just silence. Once Albert Fall got control over the oil reserves, it was like the gates had opened. The Teapot Dome and California fields, once locked away as emergency backup for the U.S. Navy, were now being carved up and handed out behind the scenes like party favors, and the public had no clue. Fall wasn't just leasing these fields legally. He was doing it without competitive bidding, which was a requirement. There were no open offers, no scrutiny, just private deals with men he knew personally, men like Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair, the same men who had helped fund Harding's campaign, the same men who had everything to gain. The first deal happened on July 12, 1921. Fall leased part of the Elk Hills Reserve in California to Doheny's company Pan American Petroleum. On paper, it looked like a national security move. Doheny would help store and transport the oil in case of emergency. Sounds noble, right? Except it wasn't. The lease allowed Doheny to pump oil for next to nothing and then sell it on the open market at enormous profit. Fall in return got exactly what he wanted: cash. And I'm not talking a discreet check or a brief thank you note. This was old-school bribery. $100,000 in cash, delivered in person by Doheny's own son Ned, along with his close friend and assistant Hugh Plunkett. Let me pause here for a second, because this part is surreal. Ned Doheny, 27 years old, barely out of college, wasn't exactly known for being responsible. He partied. He bounced from golf course to nightclubs. He wasn't a businessman, but his father decided this was the time for him to learn about the family business. So he sends Ned along with Hugh, who by this point was basically Ned's shadow, with a black bag stuffed with unmarked bills. Think about that. $100,000 in 1921 would be the equivalent of nearly $2 million today. In a duffel bag, no receipt, no contract. Just a thank you gift. They met Albert Fall in his Washington, D.C. apartment. Fall opened the bag, saw the money, and allegedly just smiled. No words were necessary. Everyone understood what this was. It was payment. Not for services rendered, but for betraying public trust. And it didn't stop there. A few months later, Fall finalized another lease this time, giving Harry Sinclair full access to the Teapot Dome Reserve in Wyoming. Again, no public bidding, no questions asked. In exchange, Sinclair handed Fall $300,000 under the table. Today, that'd be close to $5 million. These weren't investments. They weren't loans. They were bribes pure and simple. And Fall, he was drowning in debt. His ranch was failing. He owed taxes, and he needed the cash badly. Suddenly, the Secretary of the Interior was living lavishly renovating his properties, buying livestock, expanding his land holdings, all while claiming he was just a patriot making sure America had access to oil in case of war. But the truth is, it wasn't about America. It was about him. And the people around him, they weren't blind. Washington insiders started whispering. Why was Harry Sinclair constantly visiting Fall's office? Why were members of Harding's Circle suddenly buying up oil stock and cashing out for millions overnight? The corruption was seeping through the cracks, slowly, quietly, but it was there. Still, Fall thought he was untouchable. He had the president's trust, the oilmen's money, the power of a government position. He was bold, too bold, and the more confident he got, the sloppier the operation became. He told himself and others that these deals were for the good of national security, that they were necessary, efficient, patriotic even. But you know what? I think Fall believed the rules didn't apply to him. That he'd gotten so deep into this world of backdoor deals and quiet power that he convinced himself this was just how the game was played. And maybe it was. But every game leaves a trail, and in this one the money was just the beginning. Because soon secrets would start to spill, and the very people who helped cover things up would suddenly find themselves under a microscope they couldn't escape. And for some, that microscope would become a death sentence. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Smoke. At first no one said anything out loud, but the whispers were there. Washington is a city built on secrets. Everyone has them, and everyone thinks theirs are safe until someone else starts asking the wrong questions. And in 1922, people were starting to talk. Why was Harry Sinclair, one of the most powerful oil tycoons in the country, spending so much time at the Department of the Interior? Why were high-level officials suddenly cashing in massive amounts of Sinclair oil stock? And how did they all seem to know months before the public did that this stock was about to skyrocket? It wasn't just coincidence, and it wasn't subtle. Inside the Capitol, a few senators started raising their eyebrows. Among them was Senator Thomas J. Walsh from Montana. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't part of the boys' club, but he had something a lot of the others didn't: persistence. And outside of Washington, far from the marble columns and velvet-draped clubs, a reporter named Carl Magee was also paying attention. Magee had moved to New Mexico after his wife became ill, but his reputation as a relentless investigative journalist had followed him like a shadow. He didn't like corruption. He especially didn't like Albert Fall. And Fall, he knew it. But back in Washington, Fall was still riding high. After handing off oil reserves to Doheny and Sinclair, he had money pouring in quietly, of course. He paid off his debts, restored his ranch, and even began expanding his property. To the public, it looked like a self-made man living out the American dream. But to those who knew what to look for, the story didn't line up. Fall had been broke. Everyone knew that. And now suddenly he was flush with cash. No explanation. No business deal to back it up. Just silence and smugness. To buy time and deflect suspicion, Fall came up with a new strategy. He tried to make it look official. He planned to announce the oil leases publicly and frame them as part of a national defense plan. The narrative was simple: if there was ever a war or energy crisis, these companies could quickly supply oil to the military. It was patriotic, efficient, responsible. At least that's what he wanted people to believe. But before Fall could hold his press conference, something unexpected happened. On April 14, 1922, the Wall Street Journal published an article quietly but devastatingly. It revealed that the Department of the Interior had secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies with no competitive bidding, no oversight, no explanation. There were no mentions of bribes yet, no dollar amounts, but it was enough to ignite outrage, and once that article hit, the silence was broken. People started demanding answers. Senators called for investigations. Fall, trying to appear calm, welcomed the idea. "I have nothing to hide," he told reporters. But the truth was, he had everything to hide. And the timing couldn't have been worse for the administration. Harding had promised a return to normalcy, remember, a quiet, corruption-free America. But behind the scenes, his cabinet was cracking. The Ohio gang was no longer just a nickname, it was starting to sound like an indictment. Within 2 weeks, the Senate approved an official investigation. The Committee on Public Lands and Surveys was formed, and at the center of that investigation was one man, Albert Fall. I imagine he tried to play it cool. Maybe he still believed he could talk his way out of it, that the public wouldn't care, that people forget. But Fall underestimated one thing: when regular people feel cheated, they don't forget. This wasn't just about oil anymore. It was about trust, about the idea that public servants were supposed to protect the country's resources, not sell them off in secret deals for cash. And while Fall was trying to spin it as a patriotic decision, his associates were getting nervous. Sinclair stopped appearing in public. Doheny went quiet. Harding. He went on a nationwide PR tour to Alaska, of all places. Maybe to escape, maybe to control the narrative, maybe just to breathe. Either way, he didn't make it far, but we'll get to that later. For now, the story was no longer in Fall's hands. The press had it, Congress had it, and for the first time, the public had questions. Big ones, the kind that don't go away easily. And behind the scenes, some of the men who were once untouchable started scrambling to cover their tracks, destroying records, dodging subpoenas, and in some cases, preparing for things to get ugly, because they knew what was coming. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 6. Blackmail, Silence, and the Price of the Truth. By the summer of 1922, the Teapot Dome Scandal wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a storm, brewing on the horizon. And like every good storm, it started with tension, pressure, and people scrambling to keep the roof from caving in. Albert Fall knew things were unraveling. He could feel it. Investigations had been launched. Questions were multiplying. But instead of backing off, he tried to spin everything, claiming that leasing the reserves had been a matter of national security, that he had acted in the country's best interest. But no one was buying it, not really. And that's when things started to get messy. Because when powerful men feel cornered, they don't go down quietly. They reach for every dirty trick they can find: bribery, silence, and sometimes blackmail. Let me introduce you to a man named Frederick Bonfils. He was the publisher of the Denver Post, and he wasn't exactly known for being subtle. When a letter landed on his desk suggesting that Fall had been handing out oil leases like kisses at a wedding, those were the actual words. Bonfils saw an opportunity. He didn't want to expose Fall out of some noble journalistic mission. He wanted leverage. So instead of publishing the story, Bonfils did what many people in this circle had been doing all along. He tried to profit from silence. He sent his top reporter, a man named D.F. Stackelbeck, down to New Mexico to dig up dirt. And when Stackelbeck got there, he knew exactly who to call: Carl Magee. Remember, Carl, the reporter who had it out for Fall. He was still following the paper trail, still convinced this was bigger than people realized. Carl was relentless, and now he finally had someone on the inside who would listen. He handed over everything: documents showing Fall's suspicious land purchases train, manifests, secret meetings, even an old murder case that might have had ties to Fall. Stackelbeck took it all back to Denver, but Bonfils didn't publish a word of it. Instead, he locked the evidence in a safe and set up a meeting with Harry Sinclair, the oilman at the center of it all. We don't know exactly what was said during that meeting, but we do know that Sinclair paid Bonfils $250,000 in cash afterward, what would be over $4 million today. So the truth, it stayed buried a little longer. And that's the part of this story that haunts me most. The truth didn't stay hidden because no one found it. It stayed hidden because everyone who found it chose to sell it. But not everyone folded. Carl Magee refused to let it go. He kept pushing. And in 1923, some of the evidence he had gathered finally made it into the hands of Senator Thomas Walsh, who had been quietly fighting to keep the investigation alive. Walsh wasn't flashy, and he didn't move fast, but he moved with purpose. And now, with real documentation, he had something that couldn't be ignored. He called Magee to testify before Congress. Magee agreed. And when he spoke, he didn't hold back. He talked about the land purchases, the sudden influx of wealth, the close relationships between Fall and the oil barons. He named names Doheny, Sinclair, Fall, and called on Congress to follow the money. And just like that, the dam broke. A formal investigation was launched. Subpoenas were issued. Witnesses were called. And for the first time, the public began to understand just how deep the corruption went. Fall claimed he'd simply taken out loans from close friends, but no one could explain why those loans were made in cash in secret, delivered in person by family members with no paperwork. It was laughable, really, and tragic. Because by then, it was clear this wasn't about patriotism. It was about greed, plain and simple. And here's the thing, even though the public was finally learning the truth, the people involved were still trying to spin it, still scrambling to stay one step ahead. Sinclair and Doheny hired high-powered attorneys. Fall retreated into silence, and President Harding. He was thousands of miles away on a goodwill tour of Alaska, pretending like nothing was wrong. It was all starting to come apart, but the real heartbreak, the moment that shifted this from scandal to something darker, was still to come. Because there's something you need to know about people who live in the shadows of power when they feel cornered. They don't just silence the press. Sometimes they silence each other. And the next part of this story ends in blood. Chapter 7. Blood on the Marble Floors. If you've made it this far into the story, then you already know this wasn't just about oil, or politics, or even power. It was about what happens when people start realizing that the secrets they're holding could get them killed. By 1929, the Teapot Dome investigation had been dragging on for years. But one key moment, one that's often overlooked in the textbooks, came on a cold February night. A night that ended with 2 men dead inside one of the most luxurious homes in Beverly Hills. The place was called Greystone Mansion, 46,000 square feet of silent wealth, 55 rooms, its own movie theater, bowling alley, secret vaults, and a private security team that rivaled some embassies. It was a gift from Edward Doheny, one of the richest oil tycoons in the country, to his son Ned. But no amount of marble or money could stop what happened next. On February 17, 1929, around 2 a.m., a call came in to the LAPD. Ned Doheny has just been murdered. Get to Greystone Mansion now. When detectives arrived, they found 2 bodies inside the guest suite. Ned Doheny was lying on the floor in his silk bathrobe, a gunshot wound to the head. Blood pooled beneath him like a dark, sticky shadow. Just a few feet away was the second body, Hugh Plunkett, Ned's personal assistant, and some say his closest companion. Hugh was face down, also dead from a gunshot wound. The gun was in his right hand. A half-smoked cigarette still clung to his left. And just like that, the story was written. A murder-suicide. Hugh Plunkett had snapped, they said. He'd become unstable, angry, violent. He'd shot Ned in a moment of madness and then turned the gun on himself. Case closed. But the thing is, it never made sense. Not to the detectives. Not to anyone who actually looked at the scene. First of all, there were no fingerprints on the gun. None. Not Ned's, not Hugh's, nothing. Clean. Second, Ned had powder burns on his head, meaning the shot was fired at very close range, and he was sitting when it happened. Calm. Not in the middle of a struggle, and that cigarette still clutched in Hugh's fingers. Still lit. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of someone having a mental breakdown, shooting someone, and then managing to keep their cigarette perfectly balanced the whole time. Something was off. The official story claimed that Ned and his wife Lucy had gone to visit Hugh earlier that evening to try and convince him to admit himself into a hospital. Apparently, he'd been showing signs of emotional instability. Later that night, Hugh showed up at Greystone. Uninvited, walked into their bedroom and caused a scene. Lucy said Ned brought him downstairs to calm him down. They poured drinks, tried to talk. At some point, Ned called the family doctor, Dr. Fishbaugh, to come help. When the doctor arrived, Lucy met him at the door. As they walked down the hall, Hugh allegedly appeared, with a Colt 45 shouted at them to leave, and slammed the door shut. Moments later, they heard 2 shots. That was their story. But the deeper you look, the more it unravels. There was no official inquest, no grand jury. The coroner ruled it a murder-suicide almost immediately. Within 48 hours, it was done. And the LAPD detective assigned to the case, he didn't buy it. He told the DA something's wrong here. This doesn't add up. And at first the DA agreed. He even told reporters, "There's not a man in the United States powerful enough to stop me from investigating this." And then, nothing. 2 days later, that same DA stood in front of reporters and declared the case closed. What changed? Here's what we do know. Ned and Hugh were just weeks away from testifying in the Teapot Dome investigation. They were set to appear before a federal grand jury about that infamous cash delivery, the $100,000 in the black bag. That alone makes this more than just a domestic tragedy. It turns it into something far darker. A silencing. There were rumors, of course, that Hugh had been under immense pressure from the Doheny family. That he was being pushed aside, paid off, or worse. That his mental health had been questioned not out of concern, but to discredit him before he could talk. And then there's Lucy. Some believe she walked in on Ned and Hugh in an intimate moment and reacted out of rage. Others think Edward Doheny himself, the father, was behind it, that he couldn't risk his son's testimony, that the scandal had gotten too close to home, and maybe that's why it was wrapped up so fast, why no one asked hard questions. Because when you're that wealthy, when your name is carved into buildings and boulevards, you don't get interrogated. You get the benefit of the doubt. You get silence. The story never really recovered after that. The deaths were labeled a tragedy. The case file was buried. And Greystone Mansion. It went back to being what it always was, a monument to wealth, with a few bloodstains scrubbed from the floor. But the truth. The truth never left those walls. And what chills me most isn't just that 2 men died under mysterious circumstances. It's that the people who had the power to find out why chose not to. They closed the door, just like Hugh allegedly had done that night. And we're still left standing here nearly 100 years later, wondering what really happened behind those locked doors. Chapter 8, The Boiling Point. When 2 people die under mysterious circumstances and no one's held accountable, you expect the world to stop. Or at least, slow down. But in 1929, the deaths of Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were swept under the rug so quickly, it was like they were never meant to exist at all. No charges, no trial, no answers. And yet behind the scenes, the Teapot Dome Scandal was still simmering, getting hotter by the day. Because even though the people involved were doing everything they could to make it all disappear, someone kept pulling the thread. That someone was still Senator Thomas Walsh, the quiet, methodical man from Montana. He wasn't chasing headlines. He wasn't seeking revenge. He just couldn't ignore what was sitting right in front of him. While the country was being told that everything was fine, that this was just some bureaucratic misunderstanding, Walsh was collecting receipts. Real ones. He gathered bank records, land deeds testimony from hotel clerks' train schedules. He followed the money, and it led him exactly where everyone suspected it would, straight to Albert Fall, Edward Doheny, and Harry Sinclair. Harry. And that's when the denial started to crack. It turns out not everyone was willing to fall on their sword. Edward Doheny, under pressure, admitted that he had given Albert Fall $100,000 in cash, but insisted it was a personal loan, not a bribe. Just a friendly gesture between 2 old men, nothing more. But no one believed that. Not really. Why would someone send their son and his assistant across the country with a suitcase full of untraceable bills, just to be nice? The public didn't buy it. The Senate didn't buy it. And by 1924, indictments were issued. Fall, Doheny, Sinclair, all of them were now officially charged with conspiracy and bribery in connection with the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves. It should have been the beginning of justice. But if you've been following this story closely, then you already know powerful men rarely go down quietly. Harry Sinclair, in a move that feels almost cartoonish today, hired private detectives to follow jurors, literally. He had them tailed and watched. And when that came out, he was held in contempt of court, finally sent to prison. 6 months, that's all. 6 months for the man who orchestrated one of the most corrupt business deals in U.S. history. Albert Fall, who took hundreds of thousands in secret payments and gave away the nation's oil for personal gain. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He became the first former U.S. cabinet member in history to be convicted and serve time for crimes committed in office. 1 year. And Edward Doheny, despite openly admitting to giving Fall that $100,000 in cash, he was acquitted. His high-powered lawyers painted him as a grieving father, a generous friend. They used his son's death as a kind of shield, a tragic figure who had already paid the ultimate price. And maybe in the eyes of the jury, he had. But if you ask me, the real price was paid by the American people, by everyone who had believed the government would protect its resources, serve the public, and operate with transparency. That illusion shattered. And what's wild is that it could have all vanished from public memory if it weren't for a few people, Carl Magee, Senator Walsh, a handful of stubborn journalists who just wouldn't let it go. They refused to be intimidated, refused to be bought off, refused to look the other way. And because of them, Teapot Dome didn't just fade into history as a minor scandal, it became a blueprint, a warning, a dark reminder of how power, money, and silence can shape a nation when no one's watching. But let's be honest, people were watching. They just didn't want to see. And maybe that's the most dangerous kind of corruption, the kind that hides in plain sight, covered in patriotic language handshakes and marble hallways. The kind that teaches us, even when the truth comes out, justice doesn't always follow. Chapter 9. The Fall Guy. When you tell a story like this one with bribes, betrayal, political power, and even death, it's natural to expect some kind of satisfying ending. A courtroom victory, a clean conviction, someone being held fully accountable. But that's not how this one ends. Because in the Teapot Dome Scandal, almost no one truly paid the price. Edward Doheny, the man who sent $100,000 in a bag with his son, walked free. Harry Sinclair, who bribed his way into government oil, served a laughable 6 months in jail. And President Harding, who appointed all of these men and benefited from their deals, died before he could ever be questioned under oath. The only person who really took the fall, ironically, and literally was Albert Bacon Fall. 1 year in prison, that's all. He served his time and then faded quietly into history, dying in 1944, with barely a penny to his name. Forgotten by most, remembered by few. But there's something poetic and honestly kind of disturbing about how this all unfolded. Because while Fall was guilty, he wasn't the only guilty one. He was the one who got caught, the one who couldn't hide his tracks fast enough, and the one who didn't have the same wealth or power to shield himself the way Sinclair and Doheny could. He became the scapegoat, the face of the scandal, the bad apple everyone could point to so they didn't have to question the entire rotten tree. And that's where the term fall guy is believed to come from. Yeah, you've probably heard it before, someone being the fall guy, the one who takes the blame so others can walk away clean. It's a term we throw around casually now. But this might be where it started. Albert Fall, the original fall guy. And that says a lot, doesn't it? Because history tends to work like that. We boil massive, complicated scandals down to one person, one face, one name to shoulder the burden, while everyone else slips through the cracks. But what happened during Teapot Dome wasn't just one man's crime. It was an entire system built on connections, loyalty, and secrecy. It was what happens when power isn't just abused, it's protected, layered, hidden behind official titles and private clubs and gated mansions. And here's the thing that sticks with me most. If Senator Walsh hadn't kept pushing, If Carl Magee hadn't kept digging, if the public hadn't cared, none of this would have come out. Not the money, not the leases, not the cover-ups, not the bodies. It all would have stayed buried beneath the surface. That's what makes this story so important to remember. Not just because of what happened, but because of how easily it happened. How quickly public resources became private profit. How loyalty to friends outweighed loyalty to the country. How the people who tried to speak up were either silenced, discredited, or conveniently erased. It makes you wonder how many other scandals we'll never hear about. How many fall guys are still out there? And how many powerful men walked away smiling while the headlines focused on someone else? Teapot Dome was supposed to be a turning point, a wake-up call. And in some ways it was. It embarrassed a generation of leaders. It pushed Congress to enact new rules about government leases and transparency. But did it really change the game? Or did it just teach the next generation how to play it better? Because if we're being honest, this story doesn't feel like history. It feels familiar. Backroom deals, shadowy donations, elected officials serving private interests, and the rest of us left wondering who's actually looking out for the public good. Maybe that's why it still matters. Because Teapot Dome wasn't just the biggest scandal of its time. It became the template for everyone that came after. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Past. When I first started digging into the Teapot Dome Scandal, I thought it was just a historical case of political corruption, a forgotten headline from the 1920s buried in some dusty corner of American history. But the deeper I went, the more it started to feel familiar. Too familiar. Because this isn't just a story about one crooked politician or a few rich oil men. It's a story about how power protects itself, how the truth can be bought, and how justice is often more about who you are than what you did. And that's what haunts me the most. You'd think that after all the headlines, the investigations, the courtrooms, the deaths, even after a president's reputation was tarnished and a cabinet member went to prison, you'd see real change. A system corrected, a lesson learned. But did that happen? Sure, Congress passed a few new rules. Government leases became more transparent. Oversight was improved on paper at least. But what about the culture, the mindset? The idea that public office is a personal reward, that loyalty to a friend can outweigh loyalty to a nation that didn't die with Albert Fall. In fact, it seems like it just evolved. Think about it. How many times in the past few decades have we seen powerful people caught in backdoor deals using public resources for private gain? How many times have we seen the blame fall on one low-level scapegoat while the people at the top walk away untouched? It's the same playbook, just with fancier suits and better PR teams. And maybe that's the real legacy of Teapot Dome. Not just that it was the first big government scandal in American history, but that it became the blueprint, the manual for how to get away with it and what to do when you get caught. Deny, delay, distract. And if that doesn't work, find yourself a fall guy. What happened at Greystone Mansion wasn't just tragic, it was symbolic. Two people entangled in a world they didn't fully control died under suspicious circumstances, and their deaths were never truly investigated, because the people who could have demanded answers didn't want them. And that's the echo I hear when I think about this story. That silence, that shrug, that look the other way culture that allowed everything to happen in the first place. So what do we do with that? Do we just accept that this is how the world works? That corruption is inevitable, that the truth will always be a luxury for those who can afford it? Or do we keep telling these stories even when they're uncomfortable, even when they don't have satisfying endings? Because we need the reminder. We need to stay angry. We need to remember that the systems we trust are only as strong as the people willing to hold them accountable. Carl Magee didn't have millions. He didn't have connections. But he had a typewriter and the truth, and that was enough to shake the foundations of the White House. Senator Walsh wasn't famous, he wasn't loud, but he was persistent. And in the end, he exposed the rot behind the curtain. Maybe that's the most we can ask for. Not perfection, not heroism, just people who won't look away. Because these stories, they're not just about the past. They're warnings. And if we're not paying attention, we'll find ourselves living them all over again. Some crimes leave behind fingerprints. Others leave behind silence. What happened during the Teapot Dome Scandal wasn't just about money or oil. It was about how easily the truth can be sold and how rarely it's bought back. Thank you for watching True Crime Echoes, where we bring light to the shadows history tried to forget. If this story moved you or made you question the system just a little, consider subscribing for more true crime stories, rooted in reality, not fiction. Because the past doesn't stay buried forever, not if we keep digging.